When I first bought my house, I never expected to get tangled up in a fight over my own land. It was supposed to be a peaceful, quiet place to call home, a retreat away from the noise of the city. The house was tucked away in a suburban area, and it had a large piece of land that stretched behind it, all the way up to a few quiet streets. The area was owned by the HOA, and I figured as long as I followed their rules, everything would be fine. But things took a strange turn when the HOA started making plans that had nothing to do with me, or so I thought. It all started one evening when I received a letter from the HOA. The letter looked official, with the HOA's logo stamped on top. At first, I thought it was just another update about community events or reminders about property maintenance. But when I opened it, my jaw nearly dropped. The HOA was proposing a major project, a shopping mall. Right on my land. And I wasn't the only one who had received this notice. All my neighbors had been informed as well. The letter claimed that the HOA was working with a real estate company to build the mall as part of a community development initiative. They said it would bring more business and services to the area, which they argued would benefit everyone. It all sounded too good to be true, and honestly, I felt a little suspicious. The problem was simple: they wanted to use a large part of my land to build this mall. A land that I had bought, paid for, and was living on. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they had confused my property with someone else's. But when I called the HOA to get some clarity, I learned that they weren't confused at all. They believed that they could take my land, even though I owned it, because it was in the area they were managing. The more they talked about it, the more upset I got. I was shocked that they even thought they could take my land without asking or offering any compensation. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a violation of my rights as a property owner. I wasn't about to let them bulldoze my home to build a mall. I immediately started researching the HOA's legal authority. What could they actually do? Could they just take my land? I learned a lot about property laws and homeowner rights, and soon, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let this go. But I knew the fight would be a long one. Still, I had no choice but to stand my ground. There was no way I was going to let the HOA take over my land, no matter how many benefits they promised. This was personal. I didn't waste any time after that. The first step was to make sure that I had all the facts straight. I called my lawyer to discuss the situation, and she explained that, while HOAs have power within the communities they manage, they couldn't just seize land that didn't belong to them without following strict legal procedures. I was relieved to hear that they couldn't just take my property by force, but I knew that the HOA had more power than I realized, and they wouldn't back down easily. Next, I made sure to speak with some of my neighbors, hoping they would back me up. Surprisingly, a lot of them were just as shocked as I was. The idea of a shopping mall in the middle of our peaceful neighborhood didn't sit well with most of them. They also expressed concern about the impact on property values, traffic, and the general atmosphere of the community. It became clear that the HOA's plans were not as universally supported as they made it seem in their letter. Some of my neighbors were even willing to join me in opposing the plan. We were all in this together, and it felt reassuring to know that I wasn't alone in this battle. However, there were still others who were excited about the idea of the mall, believing it would bring convenience and better services to the area. One neighbor, who was a member of the HOA board, even called me to try and convince me to let it happen. She argued that the mall would improve the neighborhood, create jobs, and bring more shopping options. She made it sound like I was the one being selfish by not thinking about the bigger picture. But it didn't matter to me. I didn't buy my house just to watch it be turned into a shopping district. I had a right to live in peace, and I wasn't going to back down. At this point, I knew it was time to take action. I started gathering every bit of evidence I could find, including the deed to my property, zoning laws, and even historical maps of the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let the HOA push me around just because they thought they could. I spent hours reading legal documents and online forums to learn everything I could about my rights. The more I dug, the more confident I became that the HOA had no legal right to take my land for their mall. It wasn't just about property rights, either. It was about fairness. I had bought this property with my own hard-earned money, and now the HOA was trying to take it from me without even asking or offering a fair deal. I wasn't about to let that slide. The idea of a mall being built right on top of my land was too much to bear, so I started preparing for a fight. I made plans to attend the next HOA board meeting, where the fate of the project would be discussed. I wasn't sure what would happen, but I knew I had to stand up for myself and make sure my voice was heard. The board meeting was scheduled for a few weeks later, and I spent every day leading up to it preparing. I drafted a speech to present to the board, explaining why this project was a bad idea and how it would negatively affect me and my neighbors. I was ready to argue my case and make sure they knew I wasn't going down without a fight. When the day finally arrived, I was nervous but determined. I wasn't sure how the board would react, but I knew I had to do everything in my power to protect my home. The meeting was held in the HOA Community Center, a small building with a few dozen chairs arranged in a circle. When I walked in, I could feel the tension in the room. The board members were all sitting at a long table, looking serious and focused. Karen, the neighbor who had been trying to convince me to support the mall, was sitting at the head of the table, and she gave me a cold stare as I walked in. The rest of the board members didn't seem as hostile, but I could tell they were waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath, stood up, and began my presentation. I explained how I had purchased my land legally, and how the HOA had no right to take it for a mall. I talked about the zoning laws and how the land was meant to be residential, not commercial. I also pointed out the negative impact the mall would have on property values, the environment, and the overall peace of the community. I was calm, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to let them steamroll over me. Karen didn't like what I had to say. She interrupted me several times, trying to downplay my concerns and talk over me. She argued that the mall was a good thing for the neighborhood, and that I should think of the bigger picture. But I didn't let her distract me. I kept my cool and continued with my points, showing the board members that I was serious and well prepared. Slowly, I could see that some of the other board members were starting to agree with me. They weren't fully convinced, but they were listening. After I finished, the board members began to discuss the matter. Karen was visibly frustrated, but the rest of the room was quiet. Some board members expressed concern about the legal implications of taking my land, while others seemed to be considering the long-term effects of the mall on the community. Karen was still pushing hard for the project, but her arguments weren't as strong as they had been before. I had given them something to think about, and it was clear that they were starting to second-guess their plans. In the end, the board decided to delay the project for further review. They told me they needed to do more research on the legality of taking my land and would schedule another meeting in a few weeks to make a final decision. It wasn't a win, but it was a small victory. I had managed to buy myself some time, and I knew that I had made a strong case. The fight wasn't over, but I had proven that I wasn't going to let them push me around. After the board meeting, things quieted down for a while, but I knew that wasn't the end of it. Karen didn't give up easily, and neither did the HOA. I kept my guard up, knowing they'd come back at me with more pressure. Over the next few weeks, I received several letters from the HOA, each one pushing harder for the mall project. They made it sound like the whole community was in favor of the mall, and they even suggested that if I didn't agree, I might be causing a disruption to the neighborhood's progress. It was clear that the HOA had no intention of backing down, and they were trying to make me feel like the bad guy. I wasn't surprised, but it still frustrated me. The HOA wasn't thinking about what was best for the neighborhood as a whole, they were only concerned about their own agenda. I began to get angry again. This was my home, my property, and they couldn't just decide to bulldoze it because they thought a shopping mall would be more convenient. So, I did what I had to do next. I started looking into alternative ways to fight back. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was learning fast. I spent even more time researching property law and HOA regulations. What I found was that in most cases, an HOA can only control the property within its jurisdiction, not private land. I had already confirmed that my property wasn't part of the community's common areas, so the HOA had no legal grounds to take it. But I needed to be sure, and I wanted to have more solid proof before the next meeting. I hired a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and explained my situation in detail. She was confident that the HOA couldn't force me to sell or develop my land, and that I had the legal right to refuse them. With this new legal support, I felt more empowered. I wasn't just fighting the HOA anymore, I was fighting for my rights. The letters from the HOA kept coming, but I didn't feel the same level of stress as before. I had a strategy now. My lawyer and I drafted a formal letter back to the HOA, explaining in no uncertain terms that I was aware of my rights and that they could not take my property without my consent. I also requested that they cease all further communication regarding the mall project. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for them to make the next move, I was taking control of the situation. As I prepared to send the letter, I knew that this was the turning point. If the HOA didn't back off after this, I'd be ready to escalate things further. But I hoped that they'd realize I wasn't someone to be intimidated. The legal battle could get ugly, and I wasn't looking forward to that, but I wasn't about to let them win. This wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about standing up to the HOA and showing them that they couldn't push people around just because they had power over a community. A few days later, I received a call from my lawyer. She had heard back from the HOA. The news wasn't exactly what I had hoped for, they didn't back down immediately, but the response wasn't as aggressive as I had expected either. They were trying to schedule another meeting to discuss the legalities of the project. They claimed they had misunderstood some of the zoning laws and wanted to clear things up. My lawyer and I knew that this was a stall tactic, but I wasn't about to let them drag this out any longer. The next HOA meeting was just around the corner, and I was prepared to go in with all the ammunition I needed. I had the letter from my lawyer, all the legal documents to support my case, and I was ready to make a stand. The time for talking was over. The HOA had already shown their hand, they wanted my land, and they were willing to go to great lengths to get it. But I wasn't going to let them have it. I wasn't going to let them ruin my home and my peaceful life just to make a quick buck. As the date of the meeting approached, I found myself feeling a mix of nerves and determination. This was it, the final showdown. I had already been through so much, and I wasn't about to give up now. It was going to be tough, but I had done everything I could to prepare. I wasn't going to back down. The HOA was going to have to find another way to make their mall happen, without using my land. The day of the meeting arrived, and as I walked into the community center, I could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about my land anymore, it was about taking a stand against a powerful group that thought they could do whatever they wanted. The HOA board members were already seated at the long table, looking as serious as ever. Karen, of course, was sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed in her typical smug fashion. She shot me a look as I walked in, but I didn't let it shake me. I had come prepared. The meeting was a little more formal this time, with a strict agenda, but as soon as I spoke, it became clear that the board was already on edge. They weren't used to being challenged like this. I took my seat at the front and calmly presented my case. I explained, once again, that my land was private property, and that the HOA had no legal right to take it for a mall. I had the legal documents, the zoning maps, and the letter from my lawyer to back up every single point I made. I was confident, but not arrogant. This was my land, and I had every right to protect it. Karen tried to interrupt a few times, but this time, I was ready for her. I politely asked her to let me finish, and the board members, who were starting to look a bit uncomfortable with her interruptions, agreed. As I continued, I could see that the other board members were starting to waver. They weren't as firm in their stance as they had been at the last meeting. Some of them were even glancing at each other, exchanging looks of uncertainty. I could tell that my points were hitting home. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. She started arguing that the mall would benefit the entire community and that I was being selfish by holding up progress. She claimed that the majority of the residents wanted the mall, and that I was just one person standing in the way of something great. She even tried to play the "good for the community" card, saying that it would create jobs and improve the area. But I wasn't buying it. I didn't care how many benefits she listed. This was my land, and I wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. The tension in the room was thick, and I could feel my heart racing as I prepared for the final part of my argument. I knew that this was the moment where I had to make it clear, the HOA had no right to push me around. I stood up, took a deep breath, and calmly said, "I'm not against progress. I'm not against development. But I am against the idea that the HOA can come in and take my property without my consent. This land is mine, and I have every right to say no. I am not here to make things difficult for anyone, but I'm also not going to sit back and let you make a decision that will affect my home and my life without any regard for my rights." The room went silent. For the first time, I saw Karen look unsure. The other board members were clearly reconsidering their stance, and I could feel the shift in the air. It was working. My voice had carried more weight than I thought it would. I wasn't just challenging the HOA's decision, I was challenging the way they had been treating residents like me for years. This wasn't just about the mall, it was about standing up to an organization that thought they had the power to control everything. The board members began to speak up, asking questions about the legal implications of the project. Some of them started to express concerns about the potential backlash from other residents, especially after hearing how strongly I felt about the issue. It became clear that they weren't as confident in their plan as they had been before. Karen tried to steer the conversation back to the mall, but it was obvious that she was losing her grip on the board. They were starting to realize that pushing this project forward wasn't as simple as they thought. After some heated discussion, the board president finally spoke up. He told me that they needed more time to review the legal details before making a final decision, but that they understood my position and would take my concerns into account. It wasn't the victory I had hoped for, but it was a win in my book. They had delayed the project, and they weren't rushing to bulldoze my land anymore. The ball was in my court now. I had made it clear that I wasn't going down without a fight, and that was enough to make them hesitate. As the meeting ended, Karen stormed out, still muttering about how the mall was going to happen whether I liked it or not. But I didn't care. The tide was turning. I knew that I had done everything I could to protect my property, and it was only a matter of time before the HOA realized they couldn't push me around anymore. For now, though, I had won some time, and I wasn't about to waste it. I was going to keep fighting until they gave up on the mall project for good. The following weeks were tense, but they brought a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a while. The HOA board was dragging its feet, and that gave me the breathing room I needed. I continued to monitor the situation closely, constantly checking in with my lawyer to make sure we were prepared for whatever they threw my way next. At the same time, I tried to go on with my life, keeping the worry at bay as much as I could. My home, my land, and my peace were on the line, but I wasn't going to let it consume me. I had a plan, and I was sticking to it. However, things weren't as quiet as they seemed. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily, and it became clear that she wasn't going to let this go. She started making calls to my neighbors, trying to rally support for the mall project. Some of them, unfortunately, still bought into her idea of progress and convenience. They argued that the mall would bring in much-needed services, such as a grocery store and a coffee shop, and that it would improve the neighborhood's overall appeal. As much as I hated to admit it, some of the arguments made sense, but I didn't believe they were enough to justify taking away someone's home. I started getting visits from my neighbors, asking for my opinion on the mall project. Some were trying to convince me to come around, while others were more neutral, just wondering what was going on. I listened to all of them, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to change my mind. My decision was final. I had already fought for my rights, and I wasn't going to let the HOA run roughshod over my property just because it would make their lives easier. Some understood where I was coming from, while others simply didn't care. But in the end, I knew this battle wasn't going to be won by convincing everyone. It was about standing firm and holding my ground. A few weeks after the meeting, I got a letter from the HOA again. This one was different from the others. Instead of demanding that I accept the mall project, they were now talking about offering me a buyout for my land. They claimed that the community needed the mall, and that my refusal was hindering the development. They even suggested a price for my land, one that was far below what it was worth. They acted like I should be grateful for their generosity. They didn't realize it, but this offer was the final straw for me. It was insulting. I took the letter straight to my lawyer, who couldn't believe the audacity of the HOA. She told me that the buyout offer was nothing more than a desperate move to make me cave. They probably thought that offering me money would be enough to get me to sell, but they were wrong. This was my land, my home, and I had worked hard to get it. I wasn't going to just hand it over for a pittance. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore, I was fighting for everyone who had ever been pressured by an HOA or anyone who thought they could take something that didn't belong to them. I knew the next meeting was coming up, and I decided that I was going to make this the final stand. I wasn't going to waste any more time playing defense. I was going to make it clear that this wasn't just a personal issue, it was about the HOA's overreach and their abuse of power. It wasn't just about a shopping mall, it was about the rights of property owners everywhere. The day of the meeting came, and this time, I wasn't nervous at all. I had all the evidence I needed. I had my lawyer's support, and I had the truth on my side. I was ready to face the board, and this time, I wasn't going to back down. Karen was there, of course, trying to push the project forward, but I could see that she was starting to realize how much trouble this was causing. The other board members seemed less sure of themselves than before, and I could tell that they were beginning to feel the pressure. I stood up once again, but this time, my speech wasn't just about my land. I spoke about the importance of respecting people's property rights and how the HOA had failed to consider the real impact of their actions. I talked about the emotional toll this had taken on me and how it had affected my peace of mind. I pointed out that the mall might not even be the best solution for the neighborhood, and that there were other ways to develop the area without resorting to taking someone's land. I wasn't just making an argument for myself, I was making an argument for the entire community. By the time I finished, the room was silent. I could see the board members exchanging looks, and this time, they didn't seem so confident. Karen, who had been so sure of herself in the past, was visibly frustrated. The board president cleared his throat and asked everyone to take a few moments to consider what I had said. It felt like a win already, but I knew we weren't done yet. After a long pause, the president spoke up again. He said that they would be postponing the decision once more, but that it would be the final review. He acknowledged that my concerns were valid and promised to consult with legal experts before making any further moves. It wasn't a total victory, but it felt like one. The HOA had finally realized that they couldn't just push me around, and that my land wasn't up for grabs. A few weeks after that meeting, things got eerily quiet. The HOA stopped sending letters, and Karen seemed to vanish from the picture altogether. I had spent so much energy fighting for my property that, at first, I wasn't sure how to relax without worrying about the next move they'd make. But as the days passed, I began to feel a sense of relief. It was clear that the HOA had backed down, at least for now. They had realized that I wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated, and the pressure they'd been putting on me had finally come to an end. Then one day, out of nowhere, I received a formal letter from the HOA. I braced myself for another round of demands, but when I opened it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. The letter was an official apology from the board. They acknowledged that they had overstepped their boundaries and that the mall project would not be moving forward. Not only did they apologize for their actions, but they also assured me that they would never again attempt to force a project on private property without the owner's consent. It was a huge relief, but also a strange feeling. After all the stress, all the fighting, and all the sleepless nights, I had finally won. My property was safe. The HOA had backed down, and their plans for the mall were cancelled. It felt like a personal victory, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been pushed around by a group in power. I had stood my ground, and in the end, the law and my rights had prevailed. With the threat of the mall project gone, I began to restore the peace I had been craving when I first moved in. I had fought hard, and now I could finally enjoy my land without fear of it being taken from me. Over the next few months, I continued to maintain my property and kept an eye out just in case the HOA tried something again. But it never happened. The quiet life I had hoped for when I first bought my house finally returned. I often think back on that battle, and I still can't believe how far things went. What started as a simple dispute over land turned into a full-on fight for my rights. But in the end, I know it was worth every ounce of energy. I didn't let anyone walk over me, and I didn't let anyone take what was rightfully mine. The lesson I learned from all of this is simple: when it comes to your home and your land, never back down. Stand up for what's yours, because in the end, you're the one who will have to live with the consequences. So, the mall never got built, and the HOA finally learned that they couldn't just take what they wanted. And me? I got to keep my home, my land, and my peace. Sometimes, when I look out at my yard, I can't help but smile. I fought for it, and I won.